I don't remember when I started to be afraid. It wasn't sudden, like a thunderclap. It was full, like water seeping through cracks. First, a slight anxiety, like a shadow falling on my shoulder. Then, the fear that I wouldn't be able to be who I wanted to be. And then, the shame that I wasn't showing off. I would wake up at night, look at the ceiling, and think, what if I just disappear? And no one would notice. And that would be easier. Because staying hurts. Staying is like standing naked in front of a world that doesn't ask if you're cold. I tried to be strong. I told myself, you have to. But every time I forced myself to speak, something inside me broke. And I started to fear not being understood. I started to fear losing myself. One day I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking cold coffee, and looking at the wall. There was a crack there, thin, almost imperceptible. And I thought, this is what I look like on the inside. Not destroyed. Just cracked. And in that crack was the truth. Because I could no longer pretend that everything was fine. I texted a friend, I'm scared. I don't know how to be. And he replied, you don't have to know. It was the first time I allowed myself not to know. Not to be strong. Not to be right. Just to be. I started writing. Not for anyone. For myself. The sentences were crooked, the thoughts were broken. But there was something alive in every word. I wrote about how I was afraid of losing myself. How ashamed I am of my weakness. How I want to disappear, but even more, I want someone to say, you can stay. And then I understood, fear is not an enemy. It is a signal. It is like a doorbell when you are not expecting guests. It says, I am here. And if you open it, it will not destroy you. It just wants you to see it. I began to talk to myself as to another. Not as to an enemy that needs to be fixed. I said, you have the right to be afraid. You have the right to cry. You have the right to not be able to stand it. And something inside answered, thank you. It wasn't healing. It was a beginning. Like the first breath after a long silence. Like light breaking through a crack. Like a crack in the wall that doesn't destroy a house, but shows that it's real. I didn't become stronger. I became more honest. And that's not enough. For a long time I thought that emptiness was something that needed to be filled. Like a room that's too quiet, and you turn on music so you can't hear yourself. Like a pause in a conversation that we fill with words so we don't seem strange. But then I realized, emptiness is not the enemy. It's a place where you can finally sit down and stop pretending. After I allowed myself to be afraid, another shadow came, loss. Not specific, not formal. Just a feeling that something was gone, and I don't know if it'll come back. It was like looking at an old photo where everyone is smiling, but you're not there anymore. Remember what it was like to be there, to be that. I named people who were there but disappeared. Not because they wanted to leave. Life just got in the way. And I don't know if it's normal to miss something that no longer has a form. I wrote them a message that I never sent. I remember when you laughed. I can still hear you saying everything would be okay. And then I erased it. Because it wasn't for them. It was for me. One evening I was sitting on the balcony, listening to the wind playing with the leaves, and I thought, what if emptiness isn't something to be filled, but something to be accepted? Like a room where you can finally be yourself. Without roles. Without expectations. Just you. I started writing about loss not as an end, but as a form of love. Because if you are sad, it means you loved. If you are in pain, it means something was real. And it is not weakness. It is proof. Like a scar, not about a wound, but about the fact that you survived. Yavov remembered Yulia. How she was silent when she was in pain. How her eyes spoke more than words. And I was afraid of losing her not physically, but emotionally. I was afraid that the pain would make us strangers. But she stayed. And so did I. And there was something sacred about that. We did not talk about the loss directly. We just sat side by side. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes with the kettle whistling like an unused heart. And I thought, maybe this is what love is, to stay when there is an emptiness between us, but we do not run away. I began to see the emptiness as pause. like a moment to breathe, like a space where something new is born. Not immediately, not loudly, but something that has roots. And then I wrote, "You have the right to lose. But you have the right to remember." And that became my ritual. I didn't fill the void, I listened to it. And it answered not with words, but with silence, in which there was more truth than in any scream. Shame is not something that screams. It whispers, quietly, under the skin, like a voice that says, "You're not like that. You're too much. You shouldn't show it." And you listen, because shame sounds like the truth when you're tired. I lived with it for a long time, like a shadow walking next to me. It was in my words that I didn't say, in the tears that I held back, in the laughter that seemed too loud. I learned to hide myself, not because I wanted to, but because I thought, it'll be safer that way. I remember how Julia once said, "You're always so calm, but I feel like there's a storm inside." And I didn't know what to say, because she was right. I learned to be quiet so as not to scare others. But inside, I was screaming. Shame made me apologize for my humanity, for my tears, for my weakness, for not always knowing how to be. And I thought, maybe if I become perfect, they won't leave me. But perfection is a prison. There's no air in it. I started writing about it, not as a confession, but as a protest. I have the right to be uncomfortable. I have the right not to know what to say. I have the right to be alive, even if it's not pretty. And every word was like a stone falling from my chest. One day I recorded a video where I was just silent. I looked into the camera, and at the end I said, "I don't know how to be, but I'm here." And it was the most honest thing I've ever said. People wrote, "Me too. I thought I was alone. Thank you for not hiding." I realized, shame feeds on silence. It's strong when we're silent. But when we speak, it weakens. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes smaller, like a shadow losing its shape in the sun. I started talking to Yulia about how I was ashamed, how I was afraid of being a burden, how I didn't always know how to support her. And she said, "You already support me, because you are real." And I cried, not from pain, from relief. Shame doesn't like the light. It wants us to hide. But when we come out, even with trembling, even with doubt, it can't stand it. Because the truth is stronger. I wrote, "You have the right to be ashamed. But you have the right not to hide." And that became my new rule. I didn't stop being ashamed, but I stopped letting it control me. I no longer apologize for the tears, for the pauses, for sometimes being silent, because that's who I am. And if someone can't stand my truth, it's not my fault. I didn't become shameless. I became free. The body remembers everything, even what we try to forget. It stores every touch, every night we lay awake, every word that was not spoken but remained a weight in our chest. We think that pain is a thought. But pain is shoulders that do not relax. It is a breath that does not reach the stomach. It is hands that do not know how to touch without fear. I lived in my head for a long time. I believed that if I thought enough, I would be able to understand myself. But the body was silent. And in that silence was the truth. I could not explain why it was difficult for me to breathe when someone looked into my eyes. Why I clenched my jaw when I heard the word love. Why I shuddered when someone touched me too gently. One day I woke up and felt that I could not get up. Not because I was sick, but because my body said, enough. It no longer wanted to pull what I was hiding. And I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and thinking, maybe I haven't listened to myself for too long. I began to notice little things. How Yulia touches my hand, lightly, as if asking for permission. How I tense up when she says, "I need you." How my shoulders sag when she's just silent next to me. And I realized, the body speaks. Always. We just don't always hear it. I began to write not only with my thoughts, but with my body. I would put my hand on my heart and ask, "What do you remember?" And it would answer, not with words, but with memories. How I stood in the hallway when I was 10 and heard my parents arguing. How I clenched my fists so as not to cry. How I learned to be quiet so as not to disturb. And I cried. Not from pain. From finally hearing myself. I began to touch myself tenderly. Not as a correction, but as a confession. When I washed my hands, I did it slowly. When I put on a shirt, I took my time. When I went to bed, I put my hand on my stomach and said, "You have the right to be tired." Julia once said, "You have become softer." And I smiled. Because this is not weakness. This is a return. To myself. To a body that no longer wants to be armor. I wrote, "You have the right not to be able to stand it with your body. But you have the right to touch yourself with love." And this became my new gesture. Every morning, not just to wake up, but to give thanks. For the fact that the body stood it. For the fact that it is still here. For the fact that it is me. I no longer fight it. I listen. And in this is healing. Not fast. Not loud. But real. Staying is not a feat, it is not a loud, "I will stand it," in front of a crowd. It's a quiet, daily action. How to make tea when you don't want to get up. How to respond to a message when you want to disappear. How to say, "I'm here," even when there's a storm inside. I thought for a long time that staying meant being strong. Being someone who doesn't break. But then I realized, staying meant being honest. Sometimes broken. Sometimes silent. Sometimes someone you don't want to see. But real. There were days when I wanted to leave. Not somewhere, just away. Turn off my phone. Delete the channel. Forget that I was creating anything. Because it seemed like it didn't change anything. That I was just repeating myself. That no one was listening. But then I saw a comment, "This video is like a breath of air." And I stayed. Not because I had to. But because someone somewhere was also staying, thanks to me. I talked to Yulia about it. About fatigue. About wanting to disappear. And she didn't say, "Hold on." She said, "I'm with you." And that was more than any, "You can do it." Because staying is easier when someone is there. I began to see staying as a gesture of love. To myself. To others. How to say, "I'm not perfect. But I'm not leaving." How to stay in a conversation even when it's uncomfortable. How to stay in the body even when it hurts. How to stay in life even when it has no answer. I wrote about it. About how we learn to be with ourselves. Not to run away. Not to fix. Just to be. And each word was like a stone that I was laying in the foundation of a home. A home where you can be yourself. I wrote, "You have the right to want to leave. But you have the right to stay." And that became my daily choice. Not heroism. But ritual. Like a breath. Like a look in the mirror. How to tell myself, "I'm not gone." Sometimes I stay for something other than myself. And for Julia. For those who read. For those who are silent, but here. And this is not a sacrifice. This is a connection. Like a thread that holds us together, even when we fall apart. I no longer look for a reason to stay. I just stay. Because this is my way of loving. Part 6. After everything, there is no fanfare. No one stands with a sign saying, "You made it." There is no music, no final shot. There is only silence. And you are in it. Alive. I wake up and don't expect anything big. I just look at the light falling on the wall. At the cup that Yulia left on the table. At the trace of the cat that walked across the floor. And I think, I am here. And that is enough. This is not victory. This is not healing. This is not the end of pain. But this is life. As it is. With cracks. With pauses. With moments when you want to disappear. And with those when you want to stay. I am no longer looking for an answer. I listen. To myself. The world. To Yulia. The body. Silence. And in this listening, there is something sacred. Like a prayer that doesn't need to be said. Like a touch that doesn't need to be explained. We sit with Yulia, silent. And I know, she doesn't expect me to be strong. She just wants me to be. And I am. Not as a hero. as a person, with fatigue, with shame, with a love that doesn't always have a form. I'm no longer afraid to be uncomfortable. I'm not afraid to cry. I'm not afraid to be silent. Because my every gesture is proof. I didn't disappear. I stayed. And that's more than enough. I look at myself in the mirror and I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for presence. And I find it. In eyes that are a little tired. In shoulders that are a little droopy. In a smile that's a little crooked. But real. I wrote, "You have the right to be alive." And that's enough. And this is not the end of the story. This is its continuation. Without guarantees. Without a script. But with the right to be. I'm no longer afraid to disappear. Because I've learned to stay. And every day is a choice. Not to run away. Not to hide. Just to be. And if someone somewhere is reading this now, I want to say, you also have the right. To fear. To fatigue. To love. To life. And if you stay, even in silence, you have already changed something. Because the world is not changed by loud words, but by those who have not disappeared.